Good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Tafe. I am the director of the Museum of American Bird Art at Mass Audubon. And I would really like to thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture. Tonight is the very first lecture in our free fall online series, The Art of Birds, Avians as Symbols, Stewards, and Storytellers. And with this series, we hope to broaden our ideas and our philosophies about what bird art is and what it can be, who tells their stories, and how. And we have 5 lectures in the series this fall, each featuring an accomplished scholar, thinker, conservationist, or artist. And we hope that you will join us for all of them by registering on our website. And again, they're all free. You just have to pre-register to get the link. I would also like to extend thanks to our IT staff and to our communication staff for making this series happen. And a very special thanks to Faith and Fred Sandstrom for their generous support of this lecture series. And finally, we welcome and encourage your questions. So please put them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those at the close of Dr. Soriano's lecture. So without further ado, tonight's talk is entitled Martin Johnson Heade's The Gems of Brazil, Hummingbird Paintings and the Feather Industry. And this will be presented by Dr. Francesca Soriano. Dr. Soriano is the Associate Curator of American Art at the Farnsworth Art Museum in Rockland, Maine. She holds a PhD from Boston University in the history of art and architecture with a specialization in 19th and 20th century American art. Her doctoral dissertation examined 19th century art that related to the acquiring, commodifying, and exchanging of birds and avian products between North and South America. Francesca graduated from Colby College with a major in art history and minor in German, and she has held positions at the Dallas Museum of Art, the Dodona Galleries in New York, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, as well as holding fellowships at the Colby College Museum of Art and the Smithsonian's American Art Museum. Her current project at the Farnsworth is an upcoming exhibition focused on late 19th and early 20th century women artists who painted Maine landscapes and its native flora. And that exhibit opens in January and runs through October. So we invite you to visit. We are so excited to have her here tonight. Please welcome Dr. Francesca Soriano.
Great. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction and for inviting me to participate in this lecture series. And I'm eager to share some of my avian art related research. So without further ado, I will pull up my PowerPoint and get started. Birds held a fascination in 19th century culture, and feathers and skins circulated wildly, whether through taxidermy and ornithological study, fashion and feathery accessory adornment, or in paintings such as those by Martin Johnson Heade. In this talk this evening, I argue that Heade's work helped popularize conceptions of hummingbirds as decorative embodiments of color and engaged with a set of marketing practices used in the display of avian specimens and related objects. I'll first focus on Heade's time in South America to demonstrate how he studied hummingbird species from specimens, highlighting how he was both aware of the burgeoning international feather trade and invested in furthering aesthetic sensibilities promoted by the industry. Then I'll turn to examine the similarities between the fashion and taxidermy industries, two fields that rose in popularity together and relied on making dead birds seem alive. Heade's paintings mimic techniques used in both millinery and taxidermy, while always visualizing his birds in the wild. These compositional choices subtly underwrote the paradox of the feather industry, that lifelike and natural came to replace alive in the minds of most 19th century consumers. He'd considered himself a monomaniac on hummingbirds since boyhood, although he first turned to the subject matter in his artwork in 1863 when he journeyed to Brazil, arriving there on September 20th. During his 6-month stay in the country, he did observe hummingbirds, although not from the wild, and made detailed notes and sketches in his journal. He hoped to turn the paintings he made into an illustrated book titled The Gems of Brazil, comprised of 20 chromolithographic prints of hummingbirds and an accompanying introduction written by himself. This project was probably inspired by the work of acclaimed ornithologist John James Audubon and John Gould, although he differentiated his proposed album in 2 key ways. The first being that he actually was setting foot in South America, unlike Audubon or Gould, and the second being that his project would, quote, not assume the importance of a scientific character, end quote. Heade's comments suggest a distance between his artistic project and the natural sciences. Within this distance, Heade not only differentiated his project from his predecessors, but also, albeit perhaps unintentionally, likened his paintings to increasingly popular and mainstream, yet aesthetically minded forms of engaging with hummingbirds, fashion, and taxidermy. Rio de Janeiro had a booming feather and skin trade, and Heade amassed his own collection of specimens while there. He filled his journal with notes about male and female bird characteristics, coloration, size, nests, and species names, as well as sketches of the specimens he observed. Heade approached his time in Brazil both as a naturalist and not. He took frequent walks in the hills near his house, an activity he described as his, quote, morning ramble. The artist demonstrated an interest in the ornithology, botany, and entomology of the region, but at the same time resisted excursions that would take him deep into the Brazilian jungles and forests, declaring that, quote, excursions through the interior would be worthwhile only if it could be traversed in a civilized way, end quote. While Heade's letters recount the many insects and plants he encountered in Brazil, he seldom writes about hummingbirds in the wild. He most likely encountered most of the dead specimens he painted in markets and shops in Rio. Local dealers were supplied with birds and feathers by the broader Brazilian industry, which by the second half of the 19th century had become one of the largest suppliers of bird skins, feathers, and zoological artifacts. Such artifacts had a large export market, as US-based feather dealers would finance hunters to hunt and kill birds in various parts of the world. Hunters supplied local dealers with large quantities of bird specimens that would be either sold at markets or shipped the specimens to auction houses in the US and Europe, where they were then sold to a new set of dealers and milliners. While Heade may not have seen many live hummingbirds in Brazil, he did work on 12 hummingbird paintings in Rio. On February 14, 1864, he exhibited those paintings along with a floral still life, a meadow scene, and a landscape of Rio at the Universal Exposition of the Fine Arts in Rio de Janeiro, promoting his display as, quote, the Gems of Brazil, a part of the collection of 20 canvases, which will be chromolithographed and published in London, and was dedicated to His Imperial Majesty Dom Pedro II, end quote. Heade had already sent 2 of his avian pictures on January 8, 1864, by English steamer to M&N Hanhart in London, a prominent chromolithography firm. Heade himself left Brazil for London on April 8th and began work on the book soon after his arrival on May 5th. Over the next several months, he drafted a 14-page introduction and worked on captions for the plates, supplementing the detailed observations he made in his journal in Brazil. Despite Heade's plans to produce 20 illustrations for the book, only 4 of the chromolithographic prints he made in England exist today. Brazilian Hummingbirds 1 depicts a male and female bird of the Sapo comet. Heade studied the Sapo comet species most extensively in preparation for his painting. He sketched and made comments about the male, including notations about the color of the bird's feathers. He wrote white on tip of back dark green, wings purple-brown, bill and park black, tail feathers brown at the base. The sketch includes notations about the color of the bird's feathers, and you might be able to make out that in the body of the bird it says crimson, and in the head it says metallic green. Heade also seems to have directly copied the position of the bird from his notebook to the print and adding a branch to support the weight of the birds. Heade's journal offers concrete clues about how he conducted observations of these and other birds from specimens as opposed to in the wild. He mentions 40 species and made pencil sketches of about half of that number. For instance, Heade notes that the crimson topaz is exactly 8 inches in length. For the Brazilian fairy, he writes the feathers seem very soft. To make these careful observations and measurements, let alone touch their feathers, Heade would have needed to study dead birds or skins. His notes also highlight an attention to color. Every species he observed is accompanied with the feathering color of both the male and female. Additional observations in his journal reference the feathers and skins market in Rio. The large quantities of bird skins and feathers that Brazil supplied were often destined for North American and European cities such as New York, London, and Paris, where the specimens would be turned into fashion accessories. Between 1818 and 1856, Ovidor Street in the city center of Rio was a focal point for the feather accessory market. The shops located there were predominantly run by French manufacturers who made feather fans and jewelry and cleaned and dyed feathers before exporting them to Europe. And you'll see here on the screen 2 examples of feathered fans produced by the firm M&E Nette, which was opened by 2 French sisters in Rio. These fans, which they were known for, are covered in feathers, but also have feathers arranged into a pattern to look like a flower, and you can see whole hummingbirds in the middle of the so-called flowers. Heade was aware of the marketing of hummingbirds and their feathers in Brazil. In an entry reflecting on the range of the Brazilian ruby hummingbird, for instance, Heade noted, "It is one of the species most abundantly sent to Europe in all collections transmitted from Rio de Janeiro, one of the most commonly called into requisition for the fabrication of the beautiful flowers made in that country." For a bird called the Brazilian wood nymph, Heade similarly wrote, "A very common bird in the shops at Rio. The blue cap is extensively used in the manufacture of feather flowers. Notwithstanding the great numbers killed for home consumption, as also for exportation, it is still very numerous in the region of Rio and the adjoining districts." For another bird, the pied Jacobin, Heade wrote, "Although this bird is very common, there is something interesting in its costume of half mourning. It is found at all the shops on the Atlantic coast of Brazil, soft velvety black. See some the white-tail feathers are merely tipped with black." Notes in Heade's journal also indicate that he formed his own collection of specimens. Alongside the observations he made on the rufous flame bearer, Heade jotted "in my collection," suggested that he had acquired an example of this species. In 1867, moreover, U.S. writer and critic Henry Theodore Tuckerman noted that Heade had, quote, "during a sojourn in South America, made a fine collection of tropical birds and butterflies, which had served him for authentic and elaborate studies," end quote. Tuckerman's comment suggests that not only did Heade amass a collection of specimens in South America, but he may have also shared it with others. On the first page of his drafted introduction for the Gems of Brazil, Heade scratched out a still visible note, "Taxidermist, 143 Fulton Street." It is unknown what exactly Heade wanted from the taxidermist or if he ever visited. However, it seems like a plausible location he sought out once back in New York. Various evidence suggests that rendering the vivid colors of his avian subjects was a central concern for Heade, as he worked to have his paintings reproduced. Heade's correspondence and his detailed note-taking on feather patterns and coloration indicate how important color was in all stages of the project. When describing the colors of hummingbird plumage in his journal, Heade consistently used terms including brilliancy, metallic, brilliant, and dazzling that testify to his deep interest in the vibrancy and visual impact of his subjects. It seems clear that Heade saw the replication of these qualities as central to the artistic and financial success of the Gems of Brazil. He'd contacted two London printers, M&N Hanhart and Day & Son, in an effort to obtain the best images and prices. While he was still in Brazil, he'd initiated the lithographic process with Hanhart, but by May of 1864, when he was in London, Heade was using Day. His negotiations with these firms centered on the quality of their reproductions. In a May 24, 1864 letter, Heade noted that even after transferring his business to Day's shop, he was, quote, not at all satisfied that the project is yet on the right track. And he warned the printmaker that it would be useless to think of having the book printed and bound here if all the plates had to be retouched, end quote. Heade's concerns about the capacity of the chromolithographic process to capture the vivid colors of bird feathers proved prescient. Period reviewers noted the print process's failures. An 1881 article noted about the gems of Brazil, quote, this work was abandoned owing to technical difficulties in the way of reproducing gorgeous coloring of the plates, end quote. The surviving prints also reveal that there were difficulties in reproducing the colors and tones of Heade's original paintings and what he would achieve in later work. Chromolithography had its limitations as a medium, as it not only depended on the lithographer's individual skill, but it was also necessary to retouch the impressions by hand, one by one. Brazilian Hummingbirds 3, the third chromolithograph completed for the Gems of Brazil project, depicts a pair of tufted coquettes. The male bird is on the right with his crest and wings outspread, sitting on the end of a branch with a mountain peak behind. The female sits on a lower branch with a nest above her. Another impression of this print at the Yale University Art Gallery highlights how the retouching process varied from impression to impression. For example, in the impression on the right, you can see an additional mountain peak that isn't present to the one on the left. Purple flowers were also added in the foreground, as well as green foliage in the area between the two tree branches. Where darker green foliage has been added on the right, Spanish moss hangs on the left. This comparison between the impressions reveals the limitations and difficulties of the medium. While birds remained similar, Heade experimented with the background to test different atmospheres, attesting to his efforts to add brilliancy and depth to the composition. The bright colors and patterns of hummingbird feathers always drove Heade's interest in the birds, and their successful reproduction was crucial for his artistic work. He seemed hopeful that he could replicate the brilliant gem-like quality of their plumage through the chromolithographic process, but this ultimately failed. Heade's preliminary sketches and careful notes about plumage color led directly into his paintings, where he depicted hummingbirds as life-size but static entities. Despite the failure of Heade's chromolithographic project, he continued to engage the hummingbird as a subject, producing numerous paintings of the birds in South American landscapes. He turned to creating his own multiples and reproductions, repeatedly painting hummingbirds with bright plumage in a variety of compositions that incorporated new elements such as orchids and passion flowers. In his later works, completed after his last trips to South America, where he visited Nicaragua in 1866 and Colombia in 1870, he'd focused solely on the medium of painting, using his brush to attempt a replication of the jewel-like tones of the bird's feathers. In these paintings, Heade worked on reproducing the iridescent quality of hummingbird feathers, a feature of the species that earned them an association with gemstones in the 19th century. While feathered hats were popular in all the forms that they came in, the more brightly colored plumage from exotic species, such as hummingbirds, birds of paradise, and parrots, were particularly sought after among middle and upper class consumers. Tropical birds and their feathers came to be associated with certain appealing aesthetic characteristics. Marketers in the feather trade advertised these species as embodiments of vivid, precious, and economically valuable color that could be worn independently in place of actual gemstones or affixed to a dress. Hummingbird feathers in particular were likened to gemstones because of their rich colors and iridescent sheen. This comparison was heightened because of the common names of hummingbirds in English and popularly used in both Britain and the US, often reference gemstones. Examples include crimson topaz, sun gem, Brazilian ruby, and amethyst wood star. Johnson's Natural History, an American publication published in 1874, which offered readers beyond the scientific community a comprehensive look at the animal kingdom, noted that the metallic blue of the hummingbird feathers, quote, has caused them often to be called flying gems. Their plumage indeed defies descriptions. The changeableness of the colors with the movement of these birds is truly wonderful, end quote. Executed at the height of this trend, Heade's prints and paintings encouraged the viewer to see the depicted hummingbirds as manifestations of dazzling color that was natural but called to mind the precious materiality of jewels. Even the title he gave to his intended lithograph series, The Gems of Brazil, made explicit the comparison between hummingbirds and gemstones. This title would have primed viewers to understand the birds depicted within the album in such a manner. As noted previously, Heade's journal and sketches of hummingbirds use words such as brilliancy, metallic, brilliant, and dazzling when describing the colors of hummingbird plumage. These works also evoke precious gemstones and could be equally interchanged between jewels and feathers. In his paintings and prints, Heade worked to capture these adjectives in the depicted birds by posing the hummingbirds to best display their feathers, layering paints to achieve a shimmering quality, and retouching his lithographs to convey brilliant and dazzling colors more accurately. The attention that Heade paid to feather patterns and color, together with his tendency to focus his paintings on the very species of hummingbirds that were most popular in period markets and feather shops, suggests that a similar set of aesthetic sensibilities drove the feather industry and Heade's work. Period reviewers sometimes picked up on this resonance. When Heade exhibited his chromolithographs in his New York studio in 1868, for example, a reviewer for the Evening Post praised, quote, several chromos of Brazilian hummingbirds whose brilliant colors harmonize with the rich tropical scenery in the background, and which he has retouched and made nearly as good as the original pictures, end quote. The idea that the brilliant colors of the hummingbirds would harmonize with the rich tropical scenery lay at the heart of the aesthetic sensibilities of the feather fashion industry. Milliners and feather dealers too highlighted the tropical background of bird plumes, promoting the feathers as valuable embodiments of color. As at least some of his viewers recognized, Heade's artwork gave painterly form to the conception of hummingbirds as colorful jewels that drove the industry. Heade's canvases of South American hummingbirds required attentive and concentrated viewing. When examined closely, such as in this painting, it is apparent that Heade positioned the hummingbirds to highlight their bright plumage, ultimately rendering them as fascinating but static objects rather than mobile forms. Sustained close looking was necessary to appreciate the meticulous way that Heade painted his avian subjects and rendered the colors of their feathers with paint and brush. He took great care in the way he reproduced the iridescent quality of the hummingbird feathers, applying the paint and layers and adding a thin glaze to convey the glimmer of the feathers. He also encoded his pictures with the sort of armatures or support structures, such as tree branches and plant stems, or in this case here, an impossibly long vine, that one might have found in both museum and commercial displays. In so doing, Heade's paintings draw certain parallels to taxidermy displays and feather fashion shop windows. Heade also created immersive environments for his pictures, which mimic the displays in his studio. Although he carefully studied and attempted to replicate the feathers accurately, his painted birds often appear less like living creatures than taxidermied specimens posed to mimic animal vitality. Spectatorship and intensive viewing gained increasing importance in the mid to late 19th century. Even beyond the visual arts, which were naturally conducive for looking, natural history museums and department stores emerged as places where citizens could look intently at objects, either to increase their knowledge of the natural world or to observe the latest fashion trends. While natural history museums and department stores were institutions of different nature, they held similarities in their display tactics. Museum and shop designers occupied themselves with similar questions of how best to display nature and commodities, respectively. Lighting and display case design were important challenges to address and became specialized professions. In natural history museums, the organized display of specimens worked alongside strategic lighting and circulation routes to legitimize the disciplines of ornithology, entomology, and botany. In department stores, active displays turned static goods into dynamic, quote, assemblages meant to represent and convey the variability of fashion, end quote, as writes design historian Emily Orr. Natural history museums and department stores aim to encourage different forms of experience for their visitors. Yet the display of objects and new approaches to maximizing visibility and creative presentation was paramount to both. Although perhaps not his intent, he showed his hummingbird paintings to the public in a studio setting that resonated strongly with the displays of the Natural History Museum, taxidermist, and feather fashion shop. In the late 19th century, an artist studio was the primary location for critics, potential patrons, and fellow artists to see works in progress or recently finished artworks. In 1875, one visitor to Heade's studio conflated the collection of objects displayed within that space with animals and plants depicted in his pictures. They wrote, quote, multitudes of butterflies from South America glitter like blue or scarlet or green gems between those brown palms, and eagles' heads and stuffed cockatoos make a fit surrounding to paintings of tropical luxuriance. A delicate, large pink orchid with its leaves growing by a mossy piece of wood led the eye by the forms of pink hummingbirds, delicate as itself, into the gray distance of a landscape. Here on the hazy hillside, this pink was again repeated like an echo of the foreground color by stray sunbeams falling through the mist, end quote. The visitor seems to describe both a painting hanging in Heade's studio and his collection of butterfly and bird specimens. A visitor described the studio as, quote, a recess in woods. It appears arched and festooned by long palm branches whose brown finger-like leaves deepened a couple of feet or more from the curved stalks on which they grow, end quote. This author's description of Heade's rooms recalls the structures of paintings of Brazilian landscapes. Heade seems to have wanted to create an immersive and arresting environment for his hummingbird paintings and landscapes. The blending of studio space, an environment that artists use to display their work to the public, and composition resonated with the display of taxidermist and millinery shops and suggests that Heade was at least aware of marketing strategies when it came to his own paintings. It's hard to know which exact painting the visitor is describing in the suggestive passage, but Heade's Cattleya Orchid and Three Hummingbirds from 1871 resonates with the work that mentions. A mossy branch sprouting a large pink orchid extends across the bottom foreground of the painting. On the right side of the branch, three hummingbirds perch. Their positioning on the branch forms a triangle with a nest of eggs in the middle. The three birds turn towards each other or towards the nest. The bird closest to the flower has a bright pink throat, which shines next to the light pink of the orchid, while the bird farthest away from the viewer displays a shimmery green coat and the closest bird a bright red tail. The orchid looms large in the foreground. Its delicate petals almost seem to sway in an imaginary breeze. A cool gray sky emerges from the tops of dense green foliage in the background, while a few decaying moss-covered branches extend from either side of the canvas. He depicted a male and female amethyst wood star protecting their nests from a red-tailed comet. Heade's paintings are structured in a way that recalls the arrangements in taxidermy cases or shop display windows, with painted backgrounds behind the specimens perched close to the picture plane. In both taxidermy displays and natural history illustrations, It was common to depict a species in a family grouping, surrounding a nest or joint habitat. These so-called habitat groups, which became increasingly popular with the opening of the American Museum of Natural History in 1869, which, as eco-critical art historians Emily Gephardt and Michael Rossi have observed, operated like, quote, windows into the natural world, or vivid presentations that enabled visitors to imagine, even to experience, nature at its most relatable, as the posed animals fed, fought, courted, and perhaps most sympathetically, cared for their own preserved families, end quote. Often, these displays were constructed views, ones that were designed specifically to draw parallels between human visitors and the animal specimens behind the glass. The stillness of Heade's hummingbirds further recalls museum and shop window displays. Though Heade depicted the birds alongside orchids and passion flowers, flowers which their especially long and thin beaks could reach into to find nectar or insects, they are never represented in the act of feeding. Heade averts the difficulty of having to depict a bird in mid-flight, a nearly impossible task to render with paint and canvas, and even more daunting with lithographic stone and paper, and instead reinforces their stillness. Heade's choice not to render his birds in hovering mid-air poses has various implications. Ornithologists frequently noted that the hummingbirds were never still, but constantly in motion from flower to flower. Considered in relation to this often repeated observation, Heade's depictions of the birds must have reinforced their similarities to the sort of lifeless specimens that appeared in a taxidermy shop window or natural history display. Naturalists frequently noted that the wings of hummingbirds were, quote, in such rapid motion that it is impossible to discern their colors except by their glittering, end quote. Heade fanned out the tails of his hummingbirds and painted their wings outspread. Some of the artist's pictures positioned the birds as if they were lifting their heads to show off the plumage of their breasts. In other paintings, Heade posed a pair of birds on a branch, one with its wings neatly folded, and the other with its wings outstretched, as if to show an open and closed version of the wings of the same specimen. In highlighting the varied colors that characterized hummingbird feathers, these compositions elided the glittering, evanescent qualities these birds' wings actually took on when moving. The poses taken by Heade's birds were similar in turn to those typically modeled by taxidermied birds in period displays. In a taxidermy mount, stuffed specimens needed to be physically attached to some element of the display, such as a branch, because it would have been impossible to incorporate a bird suspended in mid-air next to a flower, as would happen in nature. Feathered hats and accessories also needed to be displayed on pedestals. The seemingly organic arrangement described by the image on the upper right gives the impression that the displayed hats are floating in mid-air, almost like flying birds. In 1851, ornithologist John Gould displayed hummingbird specimens in the zoological gardens of Regent's Park, an example of which you see on the left. The exhibition consisted of 24 elaborate display cases, each approximately 2 feet tall by 1 foot wide, arranged in rows. Each case was designed to be viewed in the round and rested on a wooden base that was raised on a pedestal support. Between 5 and 15 hummingbirds were displayed in each case, all posed to emphasize their bright plumage. Gould also included nests and mossy branches to perch the specimens on and give the impression of a natural habitat. Although Heade makes no written mention of seeing these exhibits, the formal similarities between Heade's paintings and the display modes is apparent. Perhaps even more of note is that reviews of the display of Gould's hummingbirds noted the similarities between the birds and jewels, continuing to popularize the association of the small birds with gemstones. Satirical magazine Punch described seeing the exhibit, quote, looking upon Mr. Gould's hundreds of hummingbirds, but now flashed upon the public at the zoological gardens, we are almost made to believe that the winged wonders have fed upon emerald, sapphire, diamond, topaz, all precious jewels of the earth, end quote. The writer, in awe of seeing such iridescent colors, wonders if the birds were actually eating gemstones themselves. As the millinery trade boomed at the end of the 19th century, shop windows also grew in sophistication, complexity, and artistry. Window designers stressed the importance of stage settings that imitated nature. In fact, taxidermists and the makers of feathered accessories used a very similar skill set. Many dealers of animal specimens provided taxidermy services, in addition to refurbishment services for millinery trimming. An article published in 1886 in Forest and Stream celebrated the feather industry and makes apparent the overlaps between ornithology and the millinery trade. Describing the feather foundry of A.H. Alexander, the article described the feather designer as a naturalist and a lover of birds, who, quote, has studied bird science in books and watched them in their leafy homes, and concluded that to visit the manufactory is a privilege. To hear its head talk about bird lore is a pleasure to any ornithologist, end quote. Photographs of example display windows, such as those in L. Frank Baum's The Art of Decorating Dry Goods, Windows and Interiors, published in 1900, an example on the upper right, depict the different ways that feathered hats were exhibited to the public. Innovations in specialized apparatuses, such as flower and feather stands, became commonplace in department store windows and advanced merchandising to an almost technical and scientific discipline. Floral elements, whether foliage that dangled from the top and sides of the case or structural designs constructed out of feather flowers or more simply floral wallpaper and painted backdrops, were almost always included in millinery displays. The combination of feathers and flowers resulted in eye-catching displays that also gave the illusion of nature. Taxidermists, milliners, shop designers, and artists were all working in the art of imitating nature, albeit in different sectors of 19th century life. The illusion the viewer who described visiting Heade's studio felt is not dissimilar to the paradox inherent in bird hats and feather fans. Feathered accessories, which were often responsible for the extinction of species, were composed of the bodies of dead birds and disembodied plumes, yet as fashion objects, they reference the living animal's vitality. In Heade's concentrated effort to render the colors and patterns of feathers, he turned the birds into embodiments of brilliant color. An art journal reviewer who saw Heade's chromolithographs wrote that, quote, they picture the Brazilian hummingbirds. No words can describe their gorgeous plumage by the painter. Mr. Heade has done so with marvelous fidelity. The paintings are not only original, but exceedingly beautiful, finished, necessary with great minuteness, yet with broad effects, end quote. In praising the marvelous fidelity with which Heade rendered the plumage of his subjects, the reviewer highlighted a quality of the artist's work that appealed to audiences steeped in the display culture of the feather fashion industry and natural history museums. In rendering their avian subjects in fixed poses and carefully delineating the details of their static forms, Heade's paintings open space for the sort of still, sustained gaze that period North Americans would have trained on feather fashions and stuffed avian specimens, and which diverged dramatically from the dynamic and ambiguous visual experience that a spectator would have had before a living hummingbird, if they were able to travel to these animals' habitat. Structured in ways that paralleled the arrangements of shop windows and museum displays, and painted in vivid jewel-like colors, Heade's paintings encourage viewers to see their avian subjects as enchanting decorative objects. In so doing, they imbued their static subjects with a strange sense of vividness and dynamism. Another writer for Scribner's Monthly asked a poignant question when writing about Heade's hummingbird paintings in 1880 and the emphasis U.S. painters placed on imitating nature, writing, quote, but aside from accepting thus unquestioningly the circumstance of lifelikeness, most people never thought of asking of a painting that it be alive, instead of only lifelike, end quote. The concept of lifelike versus alive offers an explanation for why Heade's paintings, despite their exactness and detailed observations of the bodies and feathers of hummingbirds, appear to leave the birds static and lifeless. In focusing on conveying the colors and patterns of feathers, Heade replicated what he saw from the specimens he studied. He painted hummingbirds in ways that suggest their stillness, while also imbuing them with a fictive sense of animacy that echoed the displays of milliners and museums, where birds were dead yet meant to look alive. Taxidermy displays, feathered fans, hats, and jewelry often use whole birds to appear lifelike, or as accurate replicas of nature, all the while existing because they use dead animals instead of alive ones. Heade's hummingbirds in his painting were therefore accurate and lifelike, but not alive. These illusions between rendering and being nature permeated across 19th century in art, natural history, and fashion. Later in his life, Heade would embrace a conservationist perspective on the feather industry. In the 1890s, when the artist and his wife moved to St. Augustine, Florida, he started writing for Forest and Stream, a magazine known for featuring articles about hunting, fishing, and other outdoor activities. In his essays, he details caring for hummingbirds on their migratory moves, writing, quote, "My special pet is the hummingbird, and I never weary of feeding and fussing with that lovely little creature. I tame them every year, and my interest in them never flags," end quote. After describing his efforts to feed the birds with the bottle, the artist noted, quote, "It seems to me that they are becoming scarcer every year, and I can only attribute this to their slaughter for ladies' hats. But the dealers will not stop buying them, nor the ladies wearing them. Until they do, the slaughter of the innocents will continue," end quote. The passage makes clear that by the end of his career, Heade had come to embrace a conservationist attitude, joining the wave of activism against the feather trade at the turn of the 20th century. Thank you, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Francesca. That was really, really fascinating. I think we all love hummingbirds. And it's just amazing to think of how art can be such a powerful tool in how we think about birds and how we unfortunately can objectify birds. So thank you so much for that fascinating talk and just visually stunning talk. If you have questions for Francesca, please put them in the Q&A function, and we'll be happy to ask them of her. Um, First question, just from a sort of research standpoint, the sketchbooks of Heade's are they seem to be really a wealth of information. Um, how did you access all of that information, and did you get to see some of those up close and personal?
Yeah, so there's a couple components. There are the sketchbooks and which I was able to see parts of them. Some parts of them are preserved and are very fragile, but thankfully have all been digitized and transcribed. So we have like all of his writings. Um, and so there's those alongside like his drawings, his notations. And then there's also this 14-page document that he wrote at the Archives of American Art that was meant to be the introduction for this exhibition, or for this album of lithographs. And it's a fascinating look sort of at his own research process, because he's quoting Audubon and Gould and some poetry of the period that also references hummingbirds. And it's sort of a long, like you can tell it's maybe a first draft of what an introduction might look like. So a big kind of stream of conscious. And then there are the prints that exist, which are the only complete four set is at the MFA. So I was able to see those in person and kind of compare, and then track down a couple others to cross-reference just the differences and kind of track his, what he's describing in his letters as the retouching by hand and the difficulties with that. And there's also, he kept up quite extensive correspondence with John Russell Bartlett, who was the editor of a Providence newspaper, and all of his papers are at the Brown, the library at Brown. And so I was able to kind of read through their correspondence where he's in Brazil and he's writing to Bartlett of like, I can't see any hummingbirds. I don't want to go on these extensive walks, or kind of describing the marketplaces. And so from there, I was able to, kind of construct this image of him in Brazil, and like what, from his own words, what that might have looked like. And then I was, sorry, the last part of my own research on this, I was fortunate when I was a fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I was able to go to the Natural History Museum and track down and see their hummingbird collection. And so each species that he'd painted, I was able to look at in person and just kind of compare one-to-one what that might look like. So that was an interesting, that I wanted to kind of do for myself to get a sense of how he was painting.
Excellent. We have some questions about Heade's actual experience in Brazil. What do we think travel to and in Brazil was like in the 1860s?
Yeah, I think so from what I gather from his letters, did not have the best. Well, he had mixed reviews. He was first following in the footsteps of Frederick Edwin Church, a friend, a fellow Hudson River School painter, Church, and he'd also shared a studio back in New York. So some of what I described as Heade's studio, I think he picked up a lot of from Church, and this idea of kind of like opening up the studio and making it this grand spectacle. And Church was really, from what I gather, very adventurous and kind of had encouraged Heade to really go on these long hikes to kind of really experience the nature, which he had done to create his iconic paintings like Heart of the Andes. But Heade was much more reluctant to do that. He wanted to stay close by. He describes the markets, but I think was sort of wanting, like I didn't quote one letter where he's like, you basically, you don't need a naturalist gun, you need a walking stick to kind of hack back all the foliage. And a lot of his journals also describe spending time with the emperor who he dedicated that exhibition to, and also just sort of a class of a group of expatriates who were in Brazil and socializing in that scene. So I don't know what his expectations were, but it seems like maybe he had different expectations than reality being there, or so I can gather from his writing.
Interesting. We have a question about Heade's experience before heading to Brazil. What kind of training did he have? Was he a trained artist? Where did he study? And I mean, you already mentioned Church, so we know that he had other artists that he communicated with, but did he have other artists maybe that were influential? And sort of what was his background as in, his training as an artist?
Yeah, he had some formal training. He spent like the first sort of decades of his career traveling, sometime mostly around the States. He kind of spent time in various parts of New England, painting landscapes, between sort of back and forth between landscapes and still lifes. And I think he joins this group of the Hudson River School painters and takes on landscape, but not, and is like communicating with church and sharing a studio. And they have, there's art historian Maggie Chow has written a great essay, a book or chapter of her book kind of about their relationship, which I definitely recommend people who are interested in kind of that dynamic to dig into. But and then he sort of becomes obsessive about these hummingbirds, and he paints hundreds of these hummingbird paintings in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, while also dabbling in back to landscape. He kind of does an interest in marsh scenes as well. And then late in the last decade of his life, he moves to Florida and there does a couple more still life of floral scenes while he's there as well. But for, definitely immersed in a New York art scene, like sort of at the height of his career in the 19th century.
Thank you. Question about process. So you had mentioned, you had talked a little bit about how sort of limiting chromolithography was, and sort of how disappointed he'd seemed to be about that process and the reproductions. We have a question about other printing processes. Were there other processes that were available at the time to reproduce paintings that he did when he was doing his work?
Yeah, I think his draw to attempt with chromolithography was the color part and the ability to kind of to capture the color, but it's each color had to be processed individually. It often required hand coloring, going back in and painting by hand. So it just, I think because he intended, he was trying to produce this project as an album, something that could be kind of composed together, much like a book, and circulated. And while he is working with the printers, he's also trying to promote support and get a list of subscribers who can help finance the project. And then he will send the album out to them. So I think like that's the way he envisions it is very it is so, or like my understanding of this work is so related to the color. I haven't seen any, like in his sketchbook, they're just in pencil. He didn't like use a colored pencil or pastel or watercolors in that capacity, which could have been interesting. Like, I guess if he was there. Yeah, so those are the ones that are known. But yeah, I think it would have been interesting if he had maybe incorporated color in other ways too during the process.
Mhm. I think you did mention this when you were discussing Heade's training, but we have a question about did he also paint marsh scenes? And I think
Yes.
you did mention that he did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He did.
Um, how about the feather fans? This is a little bit farther afield from
Yeah.
Heade specifically, but they're so just fascinating. And I think particularly the idea of a feathered fan that is made to look like something else, made to look like a
Mhm.
flower or flowers.
Mhm.
Um, just the idea that you're taking feathers and then forming them into trying to make them look like something even different from that. And are there a lot of examples of that kind of ornament at the time where feathers are being used to sort of make something new?
Yeah, I think well, I think what's also interesting kind of along that line is I have read accounts that feathers were popular to kind of reconstruct flowers because flowers would die and the petals would wilt, but the feathers wouldn't in that way. So that's just like another interesting kind of layer to it as well. And I think I'm not an expert on all the various fashion styles, but there were definitely different arrangements of hats, and some kind of incorporated a whole bird, some incorporated various um, just like lone feathers sort of reconstructed to mimic a bird or maybe a different type of design, something of ornament. I think I also showed a pair of earrings that had hummingbird heads. And I've come across a couple examples of that, like using the whole body again. I think hummingbirds in particular, given their size, were kind of conducive for that. I also, not birds, but beetle shells were also kind of popular for that same reason, that like glittery reason. And I think I also read period accounts that talked about feathers and beetle shells as, they mimic the glittering of jewels, but they're not as expensive as buying jewels. So there's sort of an interesting play there. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any other. Oh, and then I think another one last thought sort of along this vein is, um, I think I mentioned that there was, I guess, a premium sort of placed on these quote unquote exotic or brightly colored feathers. But there was also certainly a practice of dyeing feathers too. So maybe more ordinary, more easier to acquire, more local um, birds that were native, maybe in the US, and then being dyed to mimic these bright colors was also a practice.
Mm-hmm. We have a question about those earrings and if they
Yes.
are on view. Are they in the were they in the MFA
Um,
collection?
the ones I showed around the MFA, I can't answer if they're on view, unfortunately. But there are, I also like the Cooper Hewitt Museum has some. They're kind of scattered around some museums. I think the Victoria and Albert in London has
Mm.
examples. Um, and I can't remember if that specific one I showed, but I know one pair I saw, there used to be little diamonds for the eyes,
Wow.
which is also, tying the feathers, the jewels, and all of that into one quite visceral. Yeah.
Mm. I think we'll do one final question. How successful was he as an artist? Was his landscape work, still life, or the hummingbird paintings considered his best work? Were other artists of his time also intrigued by bird life?
Oh, that's a good question. I think his I think his hummingbird paintings were some of his most successful. I think he also, partly for the sheer quantity amount that he produced and kind of returning to this subject over and over again. But I think there was also certainly interest in his landscapes and kind of especially for maybe local audiences as he traveled around New England, incorporating and depicting different environments. I tried at least in the beginning to add the dimensions of the hummingbird paintings. They're quite small. They're like 13 by, or maybe 15 to 20 inches. And his landscapes are quite around that size, maybe a little bigger as well by and large. So it's just an interesting, if you have a reference maybe for some of Church's paintings or even other like Durand or Bierstadt, some of these other painters who are painting on a much larger scale. There's that sort of monumentality that comes with their landscape painting that isn't quite the same in Heade's work. And I think, to me at least, that's sort of the beauty and the fascination with the hummingbirds, because it really like drives your focus to look really intently.
Mm-hmm.
um, and then other artists that were interested in birds, there was certainly artists like William Hurnett and Alexander Pope, who were kind of working in a trompe l'oeil still life tradition, who were more painting like sort of hunting scenes, trompe l'oeil, sort of this idea of mimicking reality, scenes of maybe dead birds after a hunt pinned up on a wall. And so there's a lot of that. Um, and I was also interested in this talk I presented as part of my dissertation. And I was also interested in artists that painted canaries, pet canaries.
Mhm.
And there was, as the late 19th century canaries were incredibly popular and fixtures of Victorian living rooms, you do see a lot in sort of like genre scenes, canaries appearing as like a living room ornament, really.
Really interesting. That'll be for your next talk. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you all for your questions. Francesca's talk has been recorded and it'll be posted on our website and our YouTube channel, so you can share it with your friends. And we'll hope you'll join us for our next lecture, which is October 23rd. And we'll feature Dr. Mary Jo Arnaldi of the Smithsonian, who will focus on bird imagery in West African art and performance. So I hope you will join us for that. Thank you all and have a wonderful night.